Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for having me. And I'm going to talk about the difference of the anabolic response, both at the muscle and the whole body level, between a quarter pound beef burger, 80/20, and then an Impossible Burger, which the Impossible Burger is designed from a macronutrient standpoint to stimulate a 80/20 burger, 80/20 beef burger. So here's me. If you have more questions, or if you want to connect outside my email, because I'll never get to it in my email. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Dr. Myohead. As long as you're nice to me, I'll answer your questions. If you're mean, it makes me cry. Um, Here's my conflict of interest statements. I am funded by the National Cattlemen's Beef Association to do research on beef, including the study, but I've also been a consultant for the board that does research for soy protein. So, I'm compromised either way. So say what you want. And I would add here, this is where I'd like to, here's my soapbox moment and I'll be done. Just because it's funded by industry probably doesn't mean it's a necessary conflict of interest. A lot of times these big federal grants that people like to have, that including I have, and we like to show off, sometimes that's just as big of a conflict of interest. So just because it's funded by a commodity board doesn't mean it's a huge COI. But today I'll talk briefly about the determinants of anabolism, like what we're looking in a protein source to actually get a response at particularly the muscle level. The whole body is important, but in the context of performance, what we're caring about is getting an increase in something we call muscle protein synthesis, which is just the rate at which we make muscle protein. And then I'll get into the actual design, study design, about comparing the Impossible Burger versus a 4 ounce beef burger, and then what you're all dying for, the results. And then if there's time there, I'll take some questions. So getting right into it, when we talk about anabolism, it's important to know that just when we say synthesis, that's only one side of the equation. You have to have breakdown as well, and the net effect being, whole body protein balance at the whole body level. That's what the RDA is based off of, which is probably incorrect. That's a different presentation. And at the muscle level, we would have muscle net balance. The problem is the muscle protein breakdown part is either really expensive or really difficult to measure in a dynamic state. So we typically only report the muscle protein synthesis side. And when you go from I'll show you the study design, but when you go from like a basal state to a fed period, in relatively healthy individuals, we're probably getting the answer we need by only measure the muscle protein synthetic side. If you talked about people in a very large energy deficit, cancer patients, clinical states like that, maybe you'd get a different answer, but we're talking about young, healthy individuals. We probably got the 95% solution. And this will be relevant for later, but usually the muscle accounts for about 25 to 50% of the whole body protein balance. So, just some information to kind of back into that. One of the big points that I think has to get made, this graph is from Johnny Biola's work back in the mid 90s. The y-axis here we have muscle net balance, and then on the x we have a couple different states, and you can see that when we're in this fasting state, we're in a catabolic condition. And we do resistance exercise. It is anabolic, but we're still overall um, in a catabolic state. If we only take in protein or amino acids, we get into a positive muscle net balance, and we're anabolic. But what's really important is if we combine exercise and feeding, it's a synergistic effect. It's not simply 2 plus 2. It's two, or I guess I should say 3 plus 3. It's 3 times 3. The effect is potentiated. So exercise and amino acids together are really where the magic happens. And the other important thing about getting a stimulation in muscle protein synthesis, this is muscle protein balance here on the y-axis. The essential amino acids are required and are the stimulators of muscle protein synthesis. So we got 3 groups here from these studies. The one on the very left is they combined essential amino acids and non-essentials. It was like 40 grams of, I think they did it in the composition of human muscle protein. And then the middle bar is essential amino acids only. And that was, I think it was like 18 grams. And then on the very right, they have 22 grams of non-essentials. And you can see that the essentials give you the exact same response as the balanced group does. Nope. There we go. And so going further up the chain there, what seems to be the real stimulator there is that since the essential amino acids are what stimulates it, is that we have this nice study where they did an infusion of the amino acids versus oral ingestion. So it's very controlled, high level science. Not how we eat, but still it's good for mechanisms. And we get 4 different infusion rates of these amino acids. And what we found, or what they found, was that the extracellular appearance of these amino acids is what dictated the muscle protein synthetic response. So you can see in the bottom you have the intramuscular concentrations of essential amino acids, and if anything, it's kind of telling you that there's a threshold that's kind of required, but there's really no relationship between the intramuscular essential amino acids and the change in muscle protein synthesis. But if you look at the top, this plasma essential amino acid appearance, you get this nice kind of like, I bet if this would go out a little longer, you'd get it to flatten out. So you get this nice plateau, this nice relationship between the stepwise increase in plasma essential amino acids and then the change in muscle protein synthesis from the fasted to fed state. And so this data is from our lab, and what I took was I took all the essential amino acid data, but from rest to the maximal concentration, so the Cmax following the ingestion of a bunch of different food sources, and I just calculated the change. So that's the y-axis here. And then we had the muscle protein synthetic data from these are fancy words, but basically the fasted to the fed state. And I made that a delta as well. And basically what I was trying to do was I was trying to recreate this figure here in the top. And I didn't do too bad of a job. And I can't, this is only data from our lab, but it's crystalline amino acids, it's whey protein, it's beef, there's soy protein, there's beans, there's peanut butter, which everyone always loves. There's all different types of food matrices represented in this graph. And if you take the data from other labs, just their averages, you'll find it fits right on these points. So it's not just us seeing this, but the take-home point here is what I observed was that you need about 100% increase in the plasma essential amino acids to get a 34% increase in muscle protein synthesis. And you're like, well, 34% seems pretty random, but generally speaking, we don't have like hard data to point to. It's kind of just a subjective feel, but most people in the field that measure muscle protein synthesis would say somewhere around 25 to 30% is what you could consider a clinically significant change. It's a real, you're really getting something. It's not just noise. So that's kind of a nice number there. If you're reading in the literature and you see they get 100% increase in EAs, but they're not reporting muscle protein synthesis, you could kind of go, well, they're getting 100% change in EEA, so they're probably getting this stimulation in muscle protein synthesis. So how do we get these increases in essential amino acids? Well, one simple way is just eat more protein. That's an answer we all like. And these are the classic studies from Dan Moore, who I think led off the presentation or the conference today. His data is here on the right, and this was egg protein. And Ali Wattard did whey protein. That's on the left. And basically, they both found the same thing. When these high quality protein sources, it took about 20 grams of that protein source to max out the muscle protein synthetic response. So you see that kind of like right here and then over here with the whey protein. Consistent though, they did see that change from the 20 to the 40 gram group, regardless of his egg or whey, it was about a 10% increase. And importantly, these are great works, but they did only do single leg exercise. A more recent study by McNaughton and colleagues, they did a whole body resistance exercise session. They actually found that the 40-gram dose gave a statistically significantly greater muscle protein synthetic response. So somewhere between, it's pretty reasonable to say that somewhere between 20 and 40 grams of, a good quality protein source, egg, whey, isolate, is probably maxing out your post-exercise protein turnover at the muscle level. But this is, egg and whey are probably, your gold standard protein isolates or, protein forms you can have. If we look at protein quality, and quality is not just necessarily the source, as in egg versus whey, it's also the matrix. So, ground beef is a much different matrix than if you got beef protein isolate, which does exist. I think it used to, but I'm getting old. These are two different graphs to kind of illustrate that point. Is on the left here we have data from Yang, and the y-axis is muscle protein synthesis, and they have these different adjusted amounts of whey protein and soy protein. And I'd really like for you just to focus on the soy protein. And what you can see is that the 20 grams and the 40 grams of ingested soy protein isolate did not cause a significant increase in muscle protein synthesis over the resting value right here in the open bar. And so it's like, oh, and for context, the Impossible Burger has about 20 grams of soy protein. And then so you're thinking, oh, well, this is going to be a slam dunk for the beef patty, right? Well, 4 ounces of a beef burger is about 113 grams. So that's what you'd see right here. And that's not really getting us a significant increase at the fed or the fed exercise state over just getting no beef protein. It wasn't until they got 170 grams. So, it doesn't look like either situation is really going to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. That said, I was lucky that we had some preliminary data in our lab. We did this study where we called it the ounce equivalence, and we did ground beef and we had some tofu. And I would make a strong argument that tofu is probably a better protein matrix and therefore a little higher protein quality than the Impossible Burger. There's just less binders and stuff in it. So this already is not looking great for the Impossible Burger, where this is statistically different between groups. This isn't a huge change, but at least you're getting a little bit of an increase, and none of the variance bar is crossing zero with the beef group, whereas the tofu group, it shows that it's going down, but really what's occurring is there's probably just no change. And then we saw the same thing at the whole body level. I've outlined the relevant groups here. You see beef sirloin in this open bar, and then the soy protein here in this gray bar. And you can see all these other sources we looked at, and soy was by far the best of the plant-based protein sources, but it's still, kind of a 40% lower rate of whole body protein synthesis at a volume match level. And I did volume match because that's what they did with the Impossible Burger and beef. They're both 4 ounces. So not looking good for the Impossible Burger based off our preliminary data. And so this is kind of a funny story. When I was writing this grant up, I thought, man, I'm a brilliant scientist. And if you've seen this presentation, you know where this is going. These were the proposed, this is straight from the grant. These are the proposed experiments. And I was at least smart enough to put in 2 Impossible Burgers. So we had the 80-20 patty and the Impossible Burger, and that was kind of a head-to-head comparison. And I was like, well, that gives us about an isonitrogenous comparison, but we're really low on the EAs. But if we add in 2 Impossible Burgers, now we'll have an isonitrogenous isoprotein comparison and an iso-EA comparison, because the EAs are what stimulate protein synthesis. So we'll kind of get in effect that protein matrix because of all the binders and everything in the Impossible Burger. So, I mean, right off the bat, we can tell that they're clearly not metabolically equivalent, despite being marketed as a 1-for-1 replacement. But I thought I was a real genius for that. And science moves quickly nowadays, and there's actually updated data. And this is what the differences actually are. 4 ounces of, and this is all from Finelli. It's a good paper where they looked at something called the diaz in pigs, but here's the macros based off their measurements. There's been a lot of studies that measure, the breakdown of beef protein. So it depends on where you look at, but we're just keeping apples to apples comparison here. You can see the 4 ounces of beef, about 365 calories, 24 grams of protein. Impossible Burger, 292, 18. The EA difference here, let's call that 9 versus 6.5. So we don't have that beautiful comparison like I thought we had, but we at least have this 8-ounce Impossible Burger, which is closer to 13 grams of EA. So theoretically, it should do just as well, if not better, than the beef burger. Like, if you gave me this data, I'd say my knee jerk would be like, that Impossible Burger is probably going to get 8 ounces of Impossible Burger, double serving, is probably going to give you a little bit better response than the 4 ounces of beef, not only because the higher EA content, but please note the difference in caloric content. By the time they eat this burger, they're probably 14 hours of fasting. So sometimes just getting calories in is going to cause turnover. So I would have thought that was going to be a little bit higher, but I'm foreshadowing. So getting into the study design, and mostly probably what you guys care about, it's just a very basic infusion study, nothing fancy. They come in on a 10-hour fast, and I tell you that because as you can see, by the time they get a burger here, it's 4 hours later, so they're at least 14 hours fasted. So it's a very contrived state in which we're going to measure this. But we get a couple biopsies, a lot of blood, and we do some voodoo with a molecular scale, as I always say, then some math, and we get the basal protein synthetic rate, and then this fed postprandial period protein synthetic rate. And what I think is important is looking at the change, the delta. So how much does it increase from the basal to the fed state? So I'll show you the basal and the fed state, but like what I'll focus on is the change between those two. Here's the participants and our exclusion criteria. Really what's important here is that they're generally healthy people. We didn't have them resistance exercise. We weren't specifically trying to find resistance trained people. It's a feeding only study. So the results are pretty translatable. If between like recreationally active and then trained individuals. If we'd have thrown in resistance exercise or something like that, then absolutely, it'd probably been a little bit more important to get resistance trained individuals. But these were just, you know, average age was like 25 to 35 and just young, healthy individuals. So the results and most of probably what most of you care about, right off the bat, because plasma essential amino acids dictate the response. And I was absolutely gobsmacked when I saw this data. What we have here is we have the actual time course on the left, and we have the area under the curve on the right. And the area under the curve was not different between the groups at all. I mean, it's a little bit elevated, but it's really not. The area under the curve gets made a big deal out of, but and all the data that I have, every time I've run it as a regression model, it never predicts the change in anabolism. What predicts the change in anabolism is the maximal concentration or the change or the rate to the maximal concentration. And so we can get a little bit of idea of that on the left here, where we have the essential amino acids at every time point we measured. The beef is here in the circles. The single Impossible Burger here is in the squares, and the double Impossible Burger is in the triangles. And I was shocked. Remember, we're talking about 8.5 grams of EAAs in the beef versus 13.5 or whatever it was in the double Impossible Burger. The double Impossible Burger, the plasma essential amino acids never gets anywhere near as high as 4 ounces of the beef burger. I mean, right, like never. I thought it would. I thought it'd be delayed. It would get up to here, but it never gets as high. In fact, it's only higher than the beef burger at this one time point. So you can take in twice the amount of Impossible Burger, and you're still not going to get that plasma essential amino acid response. So it's not looking great for anabolism for the Impossible Burger. And this is just showing, this is a big graph, and what I'm trying to show you, highlight here is what I already showed you, is that basically, although the area in the curve wasn't different between the different groups, the maximal concentration, the change from resting to max, the time, and the rate to the max concentration were all superior in the beef burgers compared to the Impossible Burgers. This is the change in whole body protein synthesis, and you can see the basal and the fed state there on the left, but I would draw your attention to the right because this is the change. So how much does it increase with feeding? And I think this is by far more important. And what you can see is that for all these graphs, the light gray and circles is the beef burger, the open white box with the squares is the single Impossible Burger, and this darker gray of triangles is the double Impossible Burger. And what you can see is that the double Impossible Burger and the beef burger give you basically an equivalent response at the whole body protein synthetic level. So you got to eat 2 Impossible Burgers to get the same response at the whole body level as a single beef patty. And that the single plant burger gave you, actually, this is a real change. This is a real decrease in whole body protein synthesis. There was a negative change of like 3 grams per 360 minutes at the whole body level. So the single Impossible Burger actually decreased whole body protein synthesis. And there's a fairly consistent response between the number of people we have. Well, moving on to the whole body protein balance, I show this because this is actually where the Impossible Burger did all right. Context, though, is that whole body protein balance is very dependent on calories and total protein intake. And so you can see that, remember, the total protein intake was darn near equivalent between the beef burger and the single Impossible Burger. And so you get them to be a very similar change in whole body protein balance. And that's why we get this big positive net balance through the double Impossible Burger. There's almost 40 grams of protein and 560 calories or whatever it is. So not really surprised there. What you guys care about, and I always make this joke because my whole family was asleep when I was running these stats in the living room the other day, is I like jumped for joy because I was like, oh wow, a hypothesis correctly predicted, the rarest thing in science. And once again, the time course data is on the left, but what I really care about is the change, and that's here on the right, and I outline what's important in red. And basically you can see that the single Impossible Burger right here in the white bar basically just whole body muscle protein synthesis just didn't change. It stayed the same rate as it was in the basal state. The beef burger got a nice, pretty solid, robust increase in the muscle protein synthetic rate. And interestingly, the double Impossible Burger was not significantly different from the single beef patty, but it also wasn't significantly different than the single Impossible Burger. But it gives you a pretty close response as a beef patty. So you need 2 Impossible Burgers, 8 ounces of the Impossible Burger to give you this in a similar response similar muscle protein synthetic responses, 4 ounces of beef. This was a nice measure that we did in the study. And this is the first time I've really seen this with whole food feeding, so I'm pretty excited about this. This is the protein synthetic ratio, or the amount of muscle protein that's contributing to whole body protein synthesis. The data is here on the right. You can see that the 4-ounce beef group, about 35% of the muscle was contributing to the whole body. 4 ounces of the Impossible Burger was 26%, and typically in the basal state, you're about 25%, so no real change. And then the double Impossible Burger got you to 30%. So even the 4 ounces of beef with not quite, like with 60% of the calories and less essential amino acids, less protein, had a greater contribution of muscle to the whole body protein turnover. And then this was really nice. I showed you guys that graph there at the very beginning where the change in Cmax was a strong predictor of the change in muscle protein synthesis, and we replicated that. Replication is really important in science, so it was nice to be able to do that. And this is probably, if you look back at those curves, this is probably why even the double Impossible Burgers, not giving us a great muscle protein synthetic response. It's just the EAs are not getting out in the plasma. And my best guess is just due to all the binders that are contained in it to keep it into a patty form. So here are the conclusions. 4 ounces of beef gave you a significantly greater muscle protein and whole body protein synthetic response than 4 ounces of the Impossible Burger. If you do a double Impossible Burger, it gives you a similar response at both levels. For the whole body protein balance, 8 ounces of the Impossible Burger is greater than the other two groups, purely because more protein, more calories. And then the plasma essential amino acids, beef gave us generally a higher and quicker Cmax, but the area in the curve was similar between all groups. So with that, I'll take any questions.